Welcome to the episode of Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner-Campbell. I'm so pleased to welcome season two's first guest, Professor Constance Backhouse, a professor at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Law, as well as a legal historian. Professor Backhouse, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And so today, I'd love for us to talk about some issues related to consumer racial profiling, but really I wanted to get us started from a historical context. You know, where are some of the ideas of what we now know as consumer racial profiling, how that happened, but more specifically, from your perspective, how do you think regulations and laws were used to enforce historical forms of anti-Black racism in consumer services? And one example would be Viola Desmond.
Right. So she would be a very good historical example. She was a businesswoman who ran a beauty salon and manufactured her own beauty products. And she was traveling throughout Nova Scotia. And she stopped in New Glasgow, a town in Nova Scotia, where she went to a movie and she sat in a seat on the main floor. And she was told by the manager and the ticket seller that she couldn't sit there. And so she thought maybe there'd been a mistake because she learned that the ticket prices were more on the main floor. There were 5 cents more, I believe, on the main floor than they were on the balcony. So she went back to the front desk to pay, and they wouldn't sell her a ticket. They told her that they would not sell main floor seating to you people, was the phrase. So she realized it was a form of race discrimination, and she made the spontaneous decision to go back to the theater. She sat in a seat on the main floor. She was then forcibly, physically removed, dragged out of the theater by a police officer and the theater manager, and locked up in a cell overnight, and went to court the next morning without a lawyer. She wasn't even told she had an opportunity to delay and find a lawyer. And she was charged with a violation of the Theatres Act, which was a piece of regulatory law in Nova Scotia, which required that all theaters pay a tax for every person who they admitted. And the tax was based on the price of the theater ticket. Since she was sitting in a more expensive seat and they would not sell her the more expensive ticket, apparently she was 1 cent short on tax.
Yeah.
And she was convicted for violating the Theatres Act and fined. She then went back home, rallied her forces, hired a lawyer, and went to court in an attempt to overturn her conviction and fine, and she lost. An all-white bench of judges concluded that there was no error in law. So there's an example of what was a neutral law set up to collect revenue from theater owners was used to enforce race discrimination and to send a lesson to individuals who wanted to contest race discrimination. So there's a consumer rule that looks neutral on the surface that is being used as a weapon to control anyone who wishes to resist race discrimination.
And thank you for sharing sort of very briefly the experience that Miss Viola Desmond had at the time. And I know when I read your chapter on Miss Desmond's experience and sort of the surrounding context of what was going on, for me, what was striking was the level of violence that she was subjected to. Right. And oftentimes when we talk about racial profiling in a broader context, we look at issues related to police. Right. And I think at this juncture, given the fact that this happened in the 1940s, and I look, if we look at the sort of the historical arc between how we know violence is sort of meted out by police or by private individuals when it comes to race discrimination and sort of the the extreme ends. I was drawn to the fact that not only was she dragged into the car, she was also subjected to physical harm and ended up in a situation where she had, I believe, from what I read, she had the harm caused to her caused permanent damage to her physical being.
Well, she was bruised and battered and humiliated by being arrested and put in jail. I guess everyone who's put in jail is humiliated. Um, I don't know that there was permanent physical damage, but certainly there was emotional damage.
Yes.
She gave up her business. She gave up her manufacturing of cosmetics that she had developed specifically for the African Canadian community. And she left the province. And
Okay.
so there was really quite a segue of complications in her life as a result of this.
Okay. And the cost of that. And I think that when we, and I certainly when I'm talking to folks about consumer racial profiling and the horrific impacts that can happen to people as a result of these experiences, I did not know that she had given up her business. And I think that there's uh the profound injustice of that and what led to her leaving the province. And, certainly in the historical tellings that I've read and the documentaries I've seen, some of those details are left out. And I think that as I look at what's happening now in society, as we are seeing an uptick in sort of racialized discrimination against particularly African Canadian communities and people of the African diaspora, I'm drawn to the fact that we need more of these sort of remembrance of where things have come from in terms of historical context to remind us, well, while it's so important to fight for your rights, there is a cost, and obviously there's a legacy because the last time you and I spoke, something that you said that sort of hit me quite profoundly was that even though she lost her court case, several decades later, her work and her legacy was profound in terms of what she meant in terms of symbolic activism towards pushing back against racial discrimination, or what I would see as a connection to consumer racial profiling today, and how brave and courageous she was, and others like her, in terms of taking on the injustices of whether it's formal forms of discrimination or segregation, or informal in this context, because it was my understanding that the theater didn't have a formal written policy to not allow Black folks in, but they weaponized the Theaters Act against her, because I remember reading as well that she had offered to pay the difference, and
Yes,
also
she did.
it was never about the money; it was
No,
about putting her in her place
right.
in many ways.
And really, the legal system fails as often as not. The judges could have interpreted what happened as a theater refusing to collect the proper fee rather than her not paying. It was they who really were in violation of that neutral act. But the law so often administered by overwhelmingly white people with a whole legacy and history of racism fails to see, the law fails to see the injustice that is being done, particularly in the face of neutral rules.
And then the recourse for those of us who may not have an understanding of how those laws would work, or the legal representation, are often left really with limited recourses or remedies for what's happened. And so the reason I asked you the question about the regulations and laws in particular is, in my research, I've found that in current times, what folks are doing as it relates to businesses and in sort of service delivery areas, in consumer spaces, is oftentimes if there's an allegation of racial profiling, or if there's an allegation of shoplifting, one of the things, and if people argue back, they get threatened with trespass and the use of the Trespass Act. And so it's something that I've thought about very deeply, because there are limited ways for people to push back or fight back against being trespassed off of property, because it is the business owner or the landlord, whoever owns that property, is allowed to determine who's on their property and the type of behavior that they accept. But I find it curious and problematic that when individuals speak back, and I can speak to my own experience. I've been in situations where I've asked, I won't obviously name the business, but I've gone in and I've been followed, and I've asked them questions about why I'm being followed and why I'm being consumer racial profiled, and whether it's a plainclothes security guard, it's a staff person, or a uniformed security guard. The threat is, we're going to physically remove you, and we're going to trespass you. And immediately, as a consumer or the person on that space, I leave. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts around just how can we deal with, the use of these laws, as you're saying. They don't always, and the people who the adjudicators don't always see those connections of how those neutral laws or regulations are used against individual communities. What can we do to kind of address that outside of a court system? Can we do anything?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to have more research. We need to be able to show that these so-called neutral policies, such as a shop owner being able to determine who comes in and who doesn't, we need to be able to demonstrate that those policies are having a significant detrimental impact on racialized communities. And the data helps, because we still live in a society in which white people hold most of the power, and they don't experience this. And so to them, it's all foreign information. And they think, are you sure? Maybe you're overreacting. Give me some evidence that this is a policy with a racially detrimental impact. So that takes time. It takes people who will do the research. It sometimes takes research funding, but we need way more of it in order to, particularly to burst the bubble of a Canadian cultural notion that somehow we don't have racism in Canada. That's a mistaken belief that we've had with us for centuries. And we need to be able to show and demonstrate with facts and figures and numbers and evidence of cases that we, in fact, have had and continue to have racism in every aspect of Canadian culture and life. So I think there's a lot of learning we need to do, more research, more education, more publicity about these findings. It's been helpful, not completely, but somewhat, to be able to demonstrate that in policing, there is a racial profiling that is having a very negative and unfair impact on racialized communities. And I think, we haven't cured the problem, but at least it's on the agenda. People can see that this is a point of debate. We don't see that much in the consumer community yet. But I think if we start tracking, maybe what we do is we look, where are African Canadian communities disadvantaged? Housing, employment, education, health. Where are they in a lower position compared to non-African Canadian communities? And then if we trace back, how did they get there? Where are the policies and the rules and the laws that are disentitling them from an egalitarian world? we almost have to look at it backwards in order to find those, in theory, neutral rules, and then unpack them and see why they are, in fact, not neutral.
No, and I do agree that looking from a historical context and lens helps us understand where we are today in terms of the practices that are in place, and in terms of looking forward to how do we then create the remedies and, in fact, eliminate the biases and discrimination that exists in today's, consumer settings, because that's really what I'm thinking about in terms of consumer racial profiling.
Right.
And then an understanding, I think, that the importance of looking at consumer racial profiling. Oftentimes when I'll have conversations with individuals and over the years, over the 10 years that I've been doing my own research and looking at issues related to consumer racial profiling, I've had experiences where people will call for assistance. Whether they're members of the community, I've spoken to folks who are considered celebrities who have been racially profiled in a Canadian context. And at the time, I was running an organization called Prevent Consumer Racial Profiling. It's kind of went dormant, but I'm bringing it back. And what was really interesting about those conversations, there was threads of commonality around the emotional impact of what had happened to them, and the lack of resources available in our communities to really talk about consumer racial profiling, as opposed to just looking at racial discrimination or racial profiling in a policing context. Because oftentimes their experience was not with police. It was with private individuals who are representative of businesses, whether it was at a cinema and other spaces. And I think that having the research to track that would be helpful. But I also think that we need some concrete, direct, sort of actionable items, because although in some ways it's not well spoken about, it's been around, as for decades and decades. It's almost hand in hand with what's happening with policing. I think that there's been a concerted effort by folks from academic spaces within communities to talk about police brutality because of the rules and the roles that policing plays in our societies. Less so about those consumer spaces where it's private security, who as a group have less oversight than the police. And in terms of, they have a Private Security Act in Ontario, they're regulated across the country. However, the rules and regulations that they have to follow in terms of interactions with members of the public is very limited as compared to the depth and breadth of the police that have to comply to their legal compliance. And then the role of private citizens who are employees and what that entails. And so I think it would be interesting to look at what is happening within those communities in terms of those businesses and the policies that they're using against, perhaps against communities as it relates to the movements within their stores, but also the conversations. Once an individual identifies that something is not right, and they have a conversation with a private security guard, or they have a conversation with a member of the staff, often the breakdown in those conversations is that the individual may feel like they've been racially profiled, but they're often left to believe that it's just in their imagination, right?
Right, which is very, very upsetting, I'm sure. So let's talk a bit about the people who resist.
Yes.
You've mentioned the toll that can take. I mean, it can take a financial toll, a physical toll, an emotional toll, a lifestyle toll. And so the first thing we need, I would say, is more people to resist. Without resistance, and I would start by saying, wherever there has been racism, there are always resistors.
Absolutely. Yes.
We should never get too depressed about thinking that they don't exist. They always exist. Most of the time we don't hear about them. They're not, their work is not publicized or supported or recognized, but they're all there. We need more of them, and we need to protect them. So I think what would make a difference here is if every person who was racially profiled in a store could collectively support each other. If they could have some kind of linkage where they learned about each other, they could have a meeting, they could talk about how could they make this more public, how could they look for a remedy. I would say that the protecting and supporting of resistors would make a massive difference. And that's where our law continually breaks down. So in theory, we have a human rights statute in each province in Canada, and one that is federal for federal employees and businesses that says there should be no discrimination in the offering of services to the public. And yet we have a virtually nil enforcement of those rules. And so that's a big problem. We've created this blanket rule, which looks really good on the surface, but our application of that rule is lacking. It's so bad that most resistors will not even turn to the human rights agenda, the human rights agency and enforcement structure, because they know years later they might or might not get a hearing, and they might or might not be able to prove their case. It's a terrible travesty that we have not put in place an extremely quick, effective enforcement wing for our human rights legislation.
And certainly in Ontario, even though many years ago they attempted to restructure, and we're now in a situation where certainly the cases that I looked for during my master's research looked at 4, 5, 6 years between the incident that happened and any kind of resolution.
I know.
Right?
It's almost laughable, but it isn't.
Yeah.
It's a travesty.
It is. I agree with you. And I think to your point about how do we get the folks who have, experienced consumer racial profiling to support each other, you certainly hear about it in the news when it pops up, right? Unfortunately, there are incidents that are happening. The folks who resist or take action will sometimes get a moment in time in the media where you see a story on Canadian press or in CBC, and they talk about that. And then depending on the community, they may rally together, but then years go by and then people forget. And so I think that there needs to be certainly there's advocacy groups. There's Black as an example, the Black Legal Action Center. There are organizations that are specifically framed on helping folks navigate the human rights system, sort of other legal avenues. And I do think we need more of an effort to have the public conversations that are sustainable, actions with resources that look at the research. Because when I started this 10 years ago, there was very limited Canadian research on consumer racial profiling. There was a Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission had done one report, which I used in my research. But then outside of that, it's really been small conversations that have happened. I had the pleasure of reaching out to one of our Canadian senators and speaking to a senator a couple of weeks ago about a dialogue that's going to be coming up in February that I'm hosting as it relates to consumer racial profiling. And we talked about the fact that there needs to be more of a focus. And part of that is because consumer spaces are often, especially if we look at shopping as an example, places and spaces that still tend to be female dominant. And in terms of shopping for households and so on. And then so the kind of profiling that's happening and the I guess the impact and the effect of that is not something that we readily talk about, and the connection with perhaps a form of gender-based violence when we look at the way in which body strip searches, these types of things, when they're looking for the alleged stolen goods, as it happened in a case called Nasia. And so I'm particularly interested in where we can move to next, as it relates to putting this on the agenda, not only of the communities that are directly impacted by consumer racial profiling, but also in sort of academic spaces where these conversations are happening quite often about racial profiling and racial discrimination. Particularly now we're in a point socially and culturally where we're going to have more pushback to even get these remedies. It won't be, it was never easy, but I don't think it's going to be particularly easy. And in terms of from an academic perspective and sort of having these kinds of conversations, do you think there is one particular space that this conversation can happen outside of sort of a classroom setting?
Well, I may not be the best person to answer that. Definitely, we need more education. We need education so that Black communities realize that these problems are not only personally directed at them, that there is a wide swath of this behavior, and that they shouldn't feel ashamed or guilty that this is something. It's a bit like what I know from sexual assault, which is victims of sexual assault, 90% or more don't ever tell anyone because they see it as shameful. And we need to change that, as well as we need to change the sense of how one reacts to what goes on in a store that is racially motivated. But I think, yes, more education in any way, shape, or form, more stories, more evidence, putting that out in podcasts, in social media, in documentaries, in articles, and I'm an old-fashioned person who believes in books. There's an importance for getting that, doing more of it and getting it out. And I want to just say, I know I've been hard on the forces of law and the human rights process. Just as there have always been resistors, there have always been people fighting to create laws that will protect against discrimination. That's been going on for, decades and decades and decades in Canadian history. So let's be thankful for them. What they need is more support. So one of the things that would help is if all of these fledgling or ongoing Black action groups had full financing.
Yes.
Why don't they have fully paid, well paid, with benefits and pension?
I agree. I think that in the end of the day, as we look down the road and we look at what's happening in our society, the under-resourcing and underfunding of these groups means that individuals are often doing things at the side of the desk.
Yes.
Because they care, because they want to make a difference. But in terms of, we have over 40 million Canadians, right? And so public awareness campaigns need to happen. We know that these resources need to be there. Our current situation, at least at the federal and provincial levels, there seems to be underfunding in some areas, but this is a social service when you think of the work that's being done, right? And advocating for sort of legislative and regulatory changes. Because ultimately in Ontario, as you rightly mentioned, and across the country, there are human rights codes that simply say you should not face discrimination when you're going to work, when you're going shopping, when you're receiving services. Yet time and time again, we have heard not only of the harms, but as well as sort of the economic impact on the communities, the life, in some cases, life-threatening impact when you're banned from a store because you're falsely accused of shoplifting, and you have nowhere else to go because you live in a community where you have limited access to transportation.
Right.
Right? There's so many the connections. Go ahead.
I mean, I know that you're expanding our understanding of racial profiling into the consumer world.
Circle back to consumer racial profiling, and we'll look at sort of the broadening out of the scope of what it has meant traditionally when we're looking at restaurants and consumer spaces. I certainly look at consumer spaces, meaning accessing government services, accessing healthcare, all of these things, and what we can do. And so we could look at so many different things, right, in areas, and turning our minds and applying sort of an intersectional anti-racism, anti-oppression lens to all of those things, and how what will be the impact on our respective, on the communities that are directly impacted by changes in policies, by austerity that's coming. And in some cases in our communities, it's already here. But I want to, and I'm mindful of our time because I know I only have you for half an hour, and we kind of we're having a great conversation about sort of different elements of what's going on in the society. What I did want to wrap with and really get sort of your thoughts, if there were two actions as it relates to dealing with consumer racial profiling, you've already mentioned a couple. Increase research, increase education as a whole, but also I think targeted research, targeted education or public education.
Yes.
But are there any two additional actions you think could be taken just from members of society who are interested in ensuring that this is an area that becomes a part of our contemplation?
Right. So I guess I would sort of double back a bit and say we need an expansion in the number of groups that are collecting this evidence, using it for educational purposes, lobbying, claiming the need for change. So we need financing and various ways to assist I mean, we're busy trying to assist small businesses and large businesses through tax credits and through, public funding. And I'm thinking, here's a place where we could put that energy and those support mechanisms. So let's fund and support the creation and the expansion and the full increasing the powers of activist anti-racist groups. Let's do that. I would say any measure that can protect someone who resists and objects in the store, elsewhere. We need to think about how we can stand with them, how we can ensure they're not isolated, how we can diminish the kind of prices that they are paying for their work on behalf of all of us. So I would say that's another hot button that we need to pay attention to, the resistors, protect the resistors. I would also say, and this is more complicated, but the more that we manage to get people who are anti-racist into positions of power, whether that mean politics or behind the scenes inside the political mechanisms, or into positions of business, into positions of government, into the educational system. We need more integration. And I realize that that's a two-edged sword that can also create division, because some of those folks may not toe the line for the anti-racist perspective as they get comfortable inside a more powerful setting. they're never really comfortable from what I understand, but there is a tendency sometimes to get quiet. And so I realize that that's a complicated ask, but I think it's necessary. You know, we've fought so hard in the women's movement to get women who understood sexism into positions where they were judges. That was
Yes.
really important to us. And that's, we made some progress on that. It doesn't always mean that they rule in a way that I would understand as anti-misogynist. Sometimes they look just like their male judge counterparts, and that's a loss for us. But nonetheless, without them there, we weren't able to make arguments about how the law should be framed and how it should be interpreted. Without them there, we can't make political arguments about how our public funds should be created through tax and spent. We aren't able to make business decisions in the retail setting that reflect what we know and understand to be fair. So we need people in those positions, and I recognize that that can also be heartbreaking in terms of that it doesn't deliver what we hope.
Yes, but we need to try, and we need to continue to do that work. And I think in the face of what I certainly hear from colleagues and others, is that we are living at a time that is particularly difficult to feel that you, as an activist or an advocate of social justice or racial justice, and using avenues like legal remedies, that there is a positive horizon,
I know.
right?
So my comment is when Viola Desmond did this, there was an even more damaging context.
Yes,
And she was on the right side of history. And
yes,
we look back now and we look at who do we revere? Who do we want to put on our currency? The $10
yes,
bill, right? And it isn't the theater manager. It's Viola
exactly.
Desmond. So we're in good company. And if the times are bad, they've been worse. There are always resistors. Ask yourself, where do you want to be placed when 50 years from now the historians come looking? Where do you want to have taken a stand? And I would highly advise people take the stand collectively. They have
Yes.
a lot more trouble excluding or harming or retaliating against resistors if we're in a group.
And we're working with each other to make that
Yeah,
difference.
and it's also more fun.
Yes, it is. Professor Backhouse, thank you so much for your time that we've spent talking and connecting. And I feel certainly the next iteration of these conversations around consumer racial profiling, at least that I am privileged to have, will continue to look at collective action and
Great.
look at where we can go, whether we get $1 from the government or we find our ways, we always find a way. And that is the beauty
Yeah.
of advocacy, and making a difference. And someone like yourself who has done extraordinary work to bring the issues to the forefront in the books that you've published. I can't say enough that I know my work has been transformed by your writing
Oh,
about Miss Desmond and others. And that I will continue to look to yourself in terms of your legal writing to really get a understanding, because I'm able then to take that out into the communities I talk to, whether it's union workers, members in private institutions, and or law students. I can have a conversation with those folks and say, here is history, but also in the contemporary context, how do we apply the lessons that have been taught to us to help bolster our energy as we move forward for this next challenge.
great. Well, that's exciting and good luck.
Thank you.